Hello everyone, I'm Bramble, a writer from Wales. If you're joining me for the first time, this story continues from my previous video, The Nightbane's Prize. I recommend watching that first. Otherwise, get your snacks because we're about to begin another short tale of Raven and Bear. Proof Heraldic. Atta ran the back of her fingers up this ew's snout as flat teeth gnawed on some flowers she had provided. It bleated merrily in response. Sir Corbyn watched their conversation with mild amusement, ensnared by his own. He glanced back at that enraged farmer and offered a fifth commisseratory nod. This old knight once again gestured to a white raven on the cloak which had been stolen back from her. Atta heard every word, though she understood little of what it meant. Eventually that farmer calmed down enough to properly explain what had happened. Yesterday, a knight approached him while the sheep grazed and demanded a reward for a wolf's ear. When advised to seek payment at Dinas Glyndwr, this man immediately threatened violence. His armour lacked any paint, its metal browned by harsh rains. Neither did he wear a cloak decorated by art which Sir Corbyn called heraldry. The old knight stroked that grey-streaked beard pensively while they listened to a description of this farmer's attacker. After Atta bid farewell to her friend, these two continued their journey down a steep path. A dry breeze pressed against them with every step. It had been over 2 hours since this pair began the journey to Duich, an island north of Gwynedd. Despite that, they were currently headed southeast. Atta pulled at her coat collar, which had grown unbearably warm after miles of sloped terrain. It was a burnt brown leather, coated by waterproof waxes. Alongside that heat, she felt a persistent pinch from a stiff pair of boots and an ache where that satchel gifted by Queen Yvonne weighed upon one shoulder, though none compared to the humidity which caused her hair to fight its braid. When they finally stopped to rest, Atta quickly switched to a crimson shawl of loose wool instead. Sir Corbyn offered this girl some water. "You gave up that flower pretty quick, lass. Not a fan of the kid who gave you it?" "The sheep was better company." Her deadpan reply caught him off guard, so she explained. "Nim is the one I punched, but I only did it because they tried to bite my face." "I don't know if that's what they were doing," he said after a considerate pause. When those bright eyes glanced up in confusion, his gut struggled against laughter. "I think Nim was trying to kiss you, Atta. As in, they liked you a lot." The princess looked down, her cheeks stained a rosy hue which slowly brightened until she hid behind both hands. Sir Corbyn turned away, giggles choked by sympathy. Eventually, they continued their journey down this mountain, eager to reach a nearby town. Unlike Dinas Glyndwr, it had no walls of stone patrolled by knights. Instead, 2 guards in leather armour stood by a wooden gate and watched them approach apathetically. Sir Corbyn pulled that cloak in front of himself wordlessly. They glanced at one another, then stepped aside. Atta's gaze shifted between these watchmen, who barely noticed her in turn. Neither appeared to be a knight, though both wore a shoulder cape draped over one arm. No heraldry decorated the guards. She managed to tear those bright eyes away from them, just in time to chase after Sir Corbyn as he stepped into town. Gwynedd was a narrow settlement beside a lake it had been named for. Nets of barbed wire surrounded various homesteads, alongside a few workshops and stores. On either side of this serpentine street, people were gathered in a market to sell their wares. Most offered home-baked snacks or fresh vegetables. Some traded clothes or spools of fabric. One woman even had dolls. Her stall immediately caught Atta's attention. The princess recalled how many girls clung to these toys possessively. She never played with any, as few children approached after their parents warned them against it. Nim had been a determined exception. Atta glanced up in surprise when Sir Corbyn nudged her shoulder and pointed at one with long black hair. His voice was gentler than normal. The harshness of this strange accent softened until she found it oddly familiar. "Do you know how to braid your hair, lass?" "No." Atta glanced between Sir Corbyn and these dolls. He nodded sternly, then turned away. "Well, you'll need one to practice on, so pick out one you like and I'll teach you later." "How do you know how to do it?" Her eyes were too preoccupied by dozens of dolls for his smile to be noticed. Each toy seemed soft to hold, dressed in pretty little frocks with embroidery thread for hair. Their buttony gazes stared back, most a dull brown, though one in particular had a bright pair and black yarn. Atta pointed at it excitedly. "That one!" "My parents taught me." As he handed over 2 ceiniog, she noticed both were stamped from silver. "Now, I'll teach you." Once his change had been returned, they wandered around the market for a few more minutes. Sir Corbyn asked a couple of residents if a man in paintless armour without any orders heraldry entered Gwynedd yesterday. None recognised this description, so he led Atta back down that road toward an inn. She followed close behind, her doll cradled in both hands. The bar stank slightly of old tobacco and fermentation from home-brewed ales. It was dimly lit, as though dusk had already fallen. When Sir Corbyn approached a man behind a long counter, Atta wandered between various tables instead. In one booth, an elderly man with a bruised cheek quietly nursed his stout. There was a darkness to its scent which reminded her of smoke. After a moment, she climbed into that seat opposite him and repeated Sir Corbyn's questions once he looked up. "Have you seen a man in armour?" Dusklit eyes glanced at the Black Knight who watched from afar. "It doesn't have any paint, and he wouldn't have heraldry either." "Aye, a knight headed to Beth Gelert." A badly bruised cheek was turned toward Atta. "Hit me until I paid for a wolf ear." "I'm sorry to say, it was no knight." Sir Corbyn approached from that bar. This elderly man glanced back in a scowl, which softened as fresh stout appeared before him. The old knight ruffled Atta's hair, then explained, "We're tracking him down. If you have any information, we'd greatly appreciate it." "What's your price?" Pale blue eyes squinted in suspicion. Sir Corbyn chuckled softly. "That's not how it works. I can't take pay from you. It's part of the high laws of Cambria." "If you say so." The man grumbled before he told them about this encounter. Little differed from that angry farmer's account. When it was finished, Sir Corbyn told Atta they should leave him to enjoy his stout, and bowed slightly in thanks. She imitated the gesture, then hopped down from her seat. A delicious smell of pan-fried bacon caught their noses once they were seated several tables away. Atta clutched that doll tighter, as pangs of hunger drummed against this little girl's hollow stomach. Those rumbles halted Sir Corbyn before he spoke. Rather than try again, the knight simply waited until an apron-clad woman brought out a bacon toastie. Atta's dusklit eyes looked up in confusion until it was pushed closer. This princess tore into her meal in a manner which befitted someone called Bear Girl. Sir Corbyn watched pensively as tiny fingers tore off chunks of meat and toast. Though that ravenous demeanour had been restrained yesterday, he understood it was harder to keep in check after hours on their feet. However, she eventually paused to glance at her greasy hands. Atta's voice shrank timidly. "I didn't use the spoon. Sorry." "It's all right. Mind if I have a question?" Sir Corbyn produced a small napkin for the child. "Can you tell me what a high law is?" Several seconds passed before an answer was given. No. Okay, well, they're important to know. He showed her that white raven on a red shield which decorated his cloak. A tiny finger reached out to stroke its feathers as Atta smiled faintly. Wrinkles creased around pebble-brown eyes in a warm simper before Sir Corbyn explained. It's my order's heraldry. Knights are required to display it by a high law called Proof Heraldic. What about the men at the gate? She leant forward while her legs kicked back and forth. They didn't have any. Those were guards. Guards don't travel. He grinned proudly at that question, then elaborated. Knights travel where the problems are, so they need to be easily identifiable. Which is why the man we're following isn't a real knight. Exactly. Sir Corbyn affectionately ran a gloved hand over her hair as his tone grew solemn. He likely stole that armour from the Avank's victims, so I feel a bit responsible. Did we come this way to catch him? Atta asked while she nibbled on some scraps of fat from the bacon. When he responded with raucous laughter, those bright eyes blinked in confusion. Hearty chuckles eventually gave way to a soft wheeze before that grin relaxed into an amused smile. Sir Corbyn sighed after a shallow breath. No, Atta, I just love eating here. I'm glad you think so highly of me though. A rosy hue spread across this little girl's cheeks once again. After it had faded, he leant in and offered a quiet apology. She lay down on their table to ignore him, then turned away to pout. Only when Sir Corbyn knelt did Atta look back at the knight. His lips creased into a regretful frown before a glove was removed to stroke her hair barehanded. In a whisper lighter than a harp's melody, he promised not to laugh again. Princess Atta sat up straight and aimed a glare of pure twilight at him. She asked Sir Corbyn for lessons instead, so no one could make her feel dumb. This old knight smiled proudly, then nodded in agreement. His ungloved hand helped the girl down from that seat before they headed outside. A beam of midday sun nearly blinded Atta, who flinched in pain as her eyes burnt brighter. She stumbled back over a lip below this doorway and bumped against their cook, whose apron had become even greasier. The child spun around, only to be handed a second toastie wrapped in brown paper. Before Sir Corbyn produced even a copper caniog, this woman shook her head in refusal. Apprehensively, Atta reached out with one hand as its counterpart still held that doll. After a small grumble of gratitude, she darted away to continue their hunt for Sir Corbyn's false knight. End of part 1. They stayed overnight in Dinas Bevgelet, a city which stretched out from an old grave. When the princess asked to whom it belonged, that old knight sighed and told her a great hero rested there. Unlike Gwynedd, each street had been paved with cobbles worn down from hundreds of footfalls each day. Instead of a barbed wire fence, walls of stone surrounded this settlement in a fashion similar to Dinas Glyndwr atop Ewytha. Sir Corbyn had acquired lodging for them at an inn called the Hound's Cradle. After a night of fitful sleep, Atta was called over to a small table in their room and shown an urn of black pigment. Her master described each ingredient and how to mix them so it spread evenly across his breastplate. Then he invited the princess to brush over patches that Avank had scraped clean. She listened attentively as Sir Corbyn explained this paint prevented rust, so most pages were expected to recolour their master's armour between quests. Once her hands had been cleaned of stray brush marks, the old knight headed downstairs to fetch breakfast. Left alone, Atta spread out that pitch-black cloak over Sir Corbyn's bed and examined its heraldry. A bone-white raven stood upon a blood-red shield, wings spread in a show of dominance. This admiration was interrupted when her master returned with 2 meals which he described as warm bread. She did not get the joke. After they had eaten, Sir Corbyn arranged 2 chairs in front of one another. Meanwhile, this young girl picked up that doll bought for her yesterday and stared at it intensely. A bright gaze narrowed with concentration as she carefully considered a problem. Eventually, those dusk-lit eyes turned to him, ready to leave. However, before a second day of travel began, Princess Atta was instructed to sit in front of her teacher. "Still don't have a name for her?" Sir Corbyn asked as stern fingers dragged that dirt-black hair into 3 parts. She tried to follow along with his movements and hummed pensively. When he glanced down at this doll, a sympathetic hiss escaped him. Strands of yarn had been loosely braided so their pattern formed unevenly. It bent sharply where some threads were randomly shorter than others. Her lips creased into a frown at this poor imitation of Sir Corbyn's work. After a quiet moment between them, Atta admitted, "I don't know many girl names." "I see." He paused to contemplate, then murmured, "Alice?" "Sure." She exhaled in a glum little sniff. "I did a bad job." "It's messy, but also a first attempt." His tone was warm despite the criticism. "Remember these faults, and it'll improve." "Can I ask you about something?" Atta unbound that doll's braid as Sir Corbyn continued to work on her own. After a hum of encouragement from him, she asked, "Why is it a raven?" "That's a story older than the calamity." He paused briefly in this plait, then continued to weave both hair and a tail. By his account, Princess Branwen was held captive in a land across their western sea 2 millennia ago. History then repeated itself as relatives of Cambria's High King were kidnapped 30 years after the Great Calamity. Those who rescued them took inspiration from that myth and wore white ravens into battle, which later became this knightly order's heraldry. When Atta glanced back in confusion, Sir Corbyn explained, "Branwen means white raven, and these birds were pivotal to her eventual freedom." "No, it's just, when was the calamity?" The princess began to slip layers of yarn over one another in a second attempt to braid Alice's hair before she paused. "Also, what does calamity mean?" 6 centuries ago. He barely resisted a chuckle at her later question, then answered it. "An empire which ruled over us was destroyed in an instant. That's the calamity." Once Atta's hair was bound in a complete braid, their quest to capture this false knight resumed. Side by side, they walked towards that stone wall which surrounded Dinas Beddgelert. After the hound's cradle had vanished from sight, this little girl tugged on Sir Corbyn's sleeve. When he glanced down at Atta, she quietly asked to learn more about his order. A warm smile overwhelmed that stern expression before a gloved hand rested on top of her head in an affectionate display. While they hiked, Sir Corbyn told Atta all he knew. This tale continued where his previous story had ended, with the rescue of their original High King's family. After they returned, that troop of warriors became Cambria's first knightly order, named to honour Princess Branwen. Though it afforded them many privileges, this was balanced by restrictions and responsibilities later dubbed the High Laws. Enthralled by Sir Corbyn's lesson, Atta's dusklit gaze failed to waver once, even though noon passed before he reached a conclusion. Together they climbed over a steep ridge between two valleys, that rocky descent from Eoifava, abandoned shortly after Dinas Bevgelet. Another mountain loomed to their north, though it was far smaller by comparison. Meanwhile, miles of river-cut hills, broken by the occasional lake, stretched onward opposite that peak. When Sir Corbyn led them down a thin road into this southern valley, a tiny hand halted him by his cloak. Before she spoke, Atta's master knelt so they were eye to eye with one another. He wore a tender smile as gloved fingers lightly brushed her cheek. The old knight promised more lessons once they reached a town in that valley ahead. Then Sir Corbyn gently tapped this girl's nose and suggested she think of more questions for him until then. Briefly, those bright eyes narrowed in a bratty scowl before the princess reluctantly nodded. When they arrived at Main Turog, Atta was shocked to find no houses or fence of barbed wire. Instead, a dozen narrow boats decorated in vibrant paint and flower pots filled this settlement. These canals were fed by a large river which ran southwest through the valley. Sir Corbyn pointed out a wall of stone stretched between each bank. He explained their dam kept Main Turog's waterways full, so that its boats remained afloat. Atta quickly noticed many residents were dressed in bizarre outfits. Shirts fastened around the front by half a dozen buttons, trousers held in place by suspenders. She had never seen this style of clothing before. Although Sir Corbyn led her along wooden walkways which bordered each canal, most townsfolk gracefully leapt between their boats. A few stepped down, only to trade with a merchant who thoughtfully tuned a crwth. Though this person wore a friendly simper, Atta slipped behind Sir Corbyn's leg. Many in Dinas Glyndŵr possessed dark skin, yet she had never seen any who were an oily black. Stranger still, they lacked any hair, and their gaze was the colour of wilted grass. When it fell upon that old knight, this merchant grinned as a raspy voice cried, "As I live and breathe, is that you, Corbyn?" "Rhonda, it's good to see you." A familiar gloved hand came to rest behind the princess before he stepped aside. "This is my new page, Atta. Were you travelling west by any chance?" "Why do you look like that?" She bit her tongue in immediate regret. When Rhonda's eyes widened, Atta murmured an apology as that dusklit gaze fell low. "I'm sorry." "Just how ignorant are you, girl?" Their tone clipped harshly, and posture grew stiff until Sir Corbyn cleared his throat. After a moment, this merchant responded with a tired sigh, then explained for Atta's sake. "My family has travelled through the woods beyond Cambria for 9 generations. That's why." "Woods?" She glanced up at her master for answers. He rested a gloved hand on the girl's head. "Do you remember the empire I mentioned, which ruled Cambria before the calamity?" "Yes." Those bright eyes darted between both adults. "Why?" "The deeper you go." Rhonda tapped a pensive finger against their instrument's body. "The quicker its land kills you. Even its outskirts sicken people. Not all, though. Some of us just change." "People couldn't live there anymore," Sir Corbyn added as he knelt to meet that dusklit gaze. "After about a century, the land was overrun with trees, and monsters began to appear." "That's why we're useful," Rhonda grinned. "We can travel." "So you trade stuff from other lands?" Atta glanced at the merchant's cart curiously. her earlier trepidation lost. She had heard people mention kingdoms outside of Cambria before, even seen delegations arrive in Dinas Glyndŵr. Still, it felt strange to picture them as places they might go. What are they like? Never travelled to them, I'm afraid. Rhonda shook their heads slowly. Eyes of wilted grass glanced up at Sir Corbyn before a smirk curled across ink-hued lips. I just trade what my family brings. You can always ask this old raven, though. Atta, go find a place to eat. His posture stiffened slightly as he frowned at them. This young girl glanced suspiciously between these adults, then nodded after a brief hesitation. Before she was out of earshot, her master had already changed the topic of conversation to that false knight. Once their voices became muffled, Atta sniffed gently until a sweet smell caught this girl's attention. Dusk-lit eyes tracked a thin trail of smoke which escaped from one boat's chimney. A small crowd was gathered around it, and each person walked away with a plate in hand. After a deep breath, she opened up her satchel to retrieve Alice. The princess hugged this doll tightly, then approached these townsfolk at an overly cautious pace. Before Atta summoned enough courage to address them, Sir Corbyn appeared. He knelt down and hovered a tender glove behind her back, which she leant into. It took a moment for that old knight to speak, but as always his voice was softer than normal toward the princess. Only a hum of deliberation escaped at first, though he eventually asked, "Did you learn a little bit about how important it is to time certain questions correctly?" Her head dipped in a slight nod before they joined that crowd to wait for a plate of apple crumble. Then this pair sat down together, on the edge of a walkway, so their legs dangled above a canal. Sir Corbyn asked if she had any more questions. Though curious about other lands, Atta recalled his reaction to Rhonda's provocation and heeded that recent lesson. After a brief glance toward her plate, the princess raised a tiny fist. It gripped a fork which she admitted was difficult to hold. He gradually corrected this child's technique until its slender handle balanced along a finger pinched under thumb. His stern demeanour melted away when Atta cried in delight at her first taste of honey-drizzled crumble. Tiny legs kicked back and forth with each bite, which Sir Corbyn mimicked as he ate some himself. However, eager to continue those lessons, this little girl tugged at the old knight's sleeve. So they rested peacefully while her master explained how one kingdom became many with their own knightly orders. Yet its oldest had endured for centuries as impartial aides and expert monster hunters, which others struggled to fight. Atta listened intently, so enraptured she barely blinked. Though her engrossment failed to halt that fork's delivery of crumble. End of part 2. Their third day of travel began soon after the second ended. Sir Corbyn apologised, yet insisted it was necessary to catch up with that false knight. For her part, Princess Atta grumbled throughout breakfast and only relented when this journey resumed. Though she woke up quicker than he expected from a 10-year-old child, those bright eyes struggled to remain open. They marched for hours along well-trodden paths. However, their progress was limited as it relied upon the accounts of those who had encountered this thief. Thankfully, he seemed wise enough not to stray from safer roads. Atta wondered whether a threat of monsters or an abundance of farmers and travellers motivated him. When they encountered a fourth victim, after only a few hours, she decided it was the latter. Morning had nearly passed them by before Sir Corbyn seemed certain of where to head next. Despite his ardent pace, their culprit remained several miles ahead long past noon. Eventually, this pair crossed over a 2-plank bridge held in place by piles of stone on either side. Those bright eyes fought the river's flow for a moment until she lost it amidst trees and shrubbery which obscured a lake further ahead. Atta, don't get distracted. This old knight's cold stare turned away as her attention returned. Once he heard a drumbeat of hurried footfalls behind him, Sir Corbyn resumed his test on their lessons with another question. Can you tell me when Cambria became multiple kingdoms and why? 3 centuries and 2 decades. Try as she might, the princess struggled not to glance at that river. Pale sunbeams had needled them since dawn and reddened Atta's skin. Her hair frizzed against its braid from humid sweat. When they pushed aside this curtain of shrubbery, dusk-lit eyes widened in a needy manner. She only looked away when that old knight cleared his throat to encourage a full answer. The last High King, Morgan ap Caradoc, didn't have an heir. There was a nephew in Clwyd, but their vassals thought they could rule themselves better. Sounds as though you disagree. Sir Corbyn glanced back at her with a frown. Once he noticed how those bright eyes were drawn towards the shore, their pace slowed. When Atta's lips drew back in a snarl before she replied, they halted entirely. The vultures probably wouldn't let Morgan choose an heir. Vultures, eh? How familiar. Sir Corbyn's stern demeanour softened slightly as a gloved hand rubbed his nape. Pensively, he stared out across this valley and pondered how to reply. Atta glanced at that lake again. She had never seen such a large body of water in her years on the streets of Dinas Glyndŵr. Ripples spread across its glassy surface, where stiff breezes struck. With each step this girl drifted closer, drawn toward a pebble-lined beach by an eerie stillness. Sir Corbyn placed a hand on Atta's shoulder before she got too close. His gaze skimmed the lake's surface as he whispered, "Never touch it." Isn't it just a lake? Dusk-lit eyes carefully searched this flooded valley until they finally found what that old knight searched for. A slender pyramid of black slate topped by a rusted spike was barely visible near the shore furthest from them. Buildings were hidden beneath these waters. He handed her a flask usually tucked behind his belt, then marched ahead. They walked beside one another as Sir Corbyn told Atta this valley's history. It happened decades before that fabled calamity struck down the empire which once oppressed them. Despite objections across all of Cambria, their former rulers had flooded a village to create a reservoir none ever drank from. When she handed back that emptied canister, he ended this lesson with a sombre sigh. It's not a lake. It's a reminder of what happens when we don't rule ourselves. After his story was done, they walked around the unused reservoir called True Erin in silence. A few minutes passed before their path crossed with another victim of that thief. Once Sir Corbyn convinced them he meant no harm, this traveller simply pointed uphill, then scampered off. Atta's bright eyes followed this stranger for a moment before her shoulders fell, saddened by their fearful reaction. Meanwhile, that old knight strode away unbothered. Though it was a short trek for Sir Corbyn, this little girl found each step far more severe than normal. The princess smelt their culprit before she saw him. He stank of coarse iron and cheap ale, which failed to obscure a rank aroma from days spent unwashed. When they spotted that man nestled underneath a tree, Sir Corbyn handed Atta his pack in preparation. Though it was heavy, she felt glad to be helpful. Eventually, this drunk noticed them and struggled into a seated position as obvious panic overwhelmed the drink. Dusk-lit eyes stared up at Sir Corbyn for instruction, eager to be of aid. Her master immediately glanced behind himself pointedly. Though Atta initially scowled in disappointment, she swiftly backed up out of sight regardless. This child barely noticed the corner of a relieved smile before Sir Corbyn's gaze turned away. That glimpse melted any resistance, as though a bowl full of porridge from their first meal together still warmed her stomach. So, rather than interfere, she instead watched this altercation brew from a safe distance. When the false knight rose, Atta winced. His armour clattered loudly where its clasps were improperly fastened. He stumbled as this dented breastplate slipped out of place with a clumsy step. There was no gambeson underneath either, only a loose shirt and leather trousers. The princess glanced at Sir Corbyn, then back to him. They were so dissimilar he could not be called a reflection. Instead, she beheld a thief of withered valour. This man eventually stepped close enough that both saw faint marks where grass-blue paint had not been fully scraped away. Sir Corbyn quickly drew his shotgun, snapped its barrel in half, then replaced the red cartridge loaded there with a grey one. Though baffled by this contraption, their false knight wore a friendly smile. Rather than raise that sword held to him by a poorly knotted string, he greeted them warmly. "I am from the Order of Branwen." Sir Corbyn threw his cloak forward so its heraldry was visible. "Tell me yours." "Ah, a fellow knight. I'm from Powys," this man replied as he stepped back from them. "I came to kill a monster, but a knight of Queen Yvonne's beat me to it, so I'm heading home." Before that rust-bitten sword could be ripped free, a shot of grey powder was fired into the thief's breastplate. Though it failed to knock him down, this false knight stumbled back in surprise. Salt crackled underfoot as Atta watched Sir Corbyn rush forward in a tackle which caused both men to fall. They punched one another in a flurry of strikes, unable to draw their swords from that position. Once enough blood had trickled from his broken nose to be tasted, the false knight surrendered. Kelwy quickly offered Sir Corbyn a bribe as he was stripped of this armour and restrained by a thick cord. When ignored, a vein throbbed against his temple. Atta tilted her head to one side, then smirked slightly. She approached at a leisurely pace until they were close enough that Kelwy's gaze left the Black Knight, who led him by an elbow. This little girl stepped out in front and turned, so their eyes met in a shared glower. "Knights only take payment from those with royal authority." Atta's tone was unexpectedly bright given how she bared her teeth in a grin. Sir Corbyn snorted softly before his lips curled into a proud smirk. Meanwhile, Kelwy had been silenced so that he no longer attempted to haggle with the old knight. Their march continued in silence until these three eventually reached a nearby town which reminded Atta of Gwynedd. Encircled in similar barbed wire, they found a smaller settlement where people rested in long shelters of metal. Slender fields of crops and pens with various livestock surrounded these. Once the guards saw Sir Corbyn's heraldry, both stepped aside so this trio could enter. Atta followed behind until they arrived at a small shed. She was told to wait outside, at which her lips thinned in a sour expression. The princess put down that second backpack usually carried by Sir Corbyn and sat on top of it. After a minute of boredom, those bright eyes looked back at this building impatiently. When she turned to face the valley behind them, her glower fell on that reminder below. Far away, its wind-borne waves gleamed with twilight as Alice was set upon Atta's knee. While they waited for Sir Corbyn to return, narrow fingers carefully untangled a braid of black yarn this doll used for hair. Dusk-lit eyes mirrored the water which had flooded a town centuries ago. Atta glanced at a crowd of people who laboured in nearby fields, then wondered whether that many lived down there once. She quietly told Alice this story and wove another plait as Sir Corbyn had taught her. It remained crooked, yet each strand was bound tighter, in a clear improvement on yesterday. The end. Hi everyone, it's Bramble again. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate any likes, comments or subscriptions. These take a lot of work to make, and your engagement helps to keep me motivated. I also want to pause for a moment to dedicate this video to my niece, who recently turned 1. Though it will be a few years before she can understand this, these stories will be here for her as she grows. Happy birthday, kid. Finally, thank you to everyone who encouraged me through writing and recording Proof Heraldic. You all are great, and in my heart, you are the Knights of Branwen. Diolch am wrando.